In the previous lesson, you learned about functions, and in fact, you wrote a couple of functions. You wrote a function for adding two numbers together because it's so difficult to do that without a function, and then you wrote a function for outputting a value of some kind. It uses the printr function, but it wraps that with a pre-element so that it looks nice as it is rendered in the browser. Well, one of the things we very briefly talked about was the fact that we had two result variables. We had one inside of the sum function and one outside of the sum function. And I had mentioned that what we had inside of the sum function was called a local variable. Result is local to the sum function. I also used the term scope. Now, first of all, what is scope? Well, it's actually quite simple. Scope is the visibility of a variable. So the scope of this result variable inside of the sum function is local scope. It is viewable inside of the sum function and not outside of it. So therefore, it is a local scoped variable. And the same is true for the A and the B parameters, because those are essentially variables as well. So anything that is defined inside of the sum function is local to the sum function, and it cannot be viewed outside of that function. However, this result variable is a global variable. It is viewable globally, at least as far as this particular file is concerned. So let's look at this. I'm going to create a new variable called greeting, and it's just going to be hello world. And this isn't going to make any sense, but this is for demonstrative purposes. Inside of sum, we are going to say echo greeting, just so that we can see this work. So let's go to the browser, let's refresh. Now, you're going to see this fatal error. Don't mind that right now, because whenever I call the output function that we wrote in the previous lesson, I'm not passing anything to it. And that's why we have this error. It says that there are too few arguments to the function output. So the output function is expecting a value. And since we didn't pass a value whenever we called output, PHP is saying, hey, there's a problem here. Now, we could easily fix this by giving this what's called a default value or a default parameter. If we say our value parameter has a default value of an empty string, that error goes away. But in this particular case, we don't really want a default value. If you're not going to call the output function and not pass anything to it, well, then why call the output function at all? So default parameters are a nice feature, but I can't really tell you when you should and when you shouldn't use them. That's up for you to decide. Does it make sense for a function to have a default parameter? Then by all means, use a default parameter. Okay, so I'm sorry, I got off track there. So, okay, undefined variable, greeting, on line 7. That is our echo statement. So even though greeting is a global variable, and I said that if something is a globally scoped variable, it is viewable globally. We should be able to see that inside of sum. But by default, we can't. We actually have to say that, hey, I know that there's this global variable out here and I want to use it. So inside of our function, on the first line of the function, we say global and then the variable that we want to use, greeting. So now, whenever we go back, we see the contents of that variable, hello world. So we can have multiple global variables. If we had a global variable 2, we could do that. We could say global and then as many global variables as we wanted to use inside of this function. So even though something is considered a global variable, it is only usable inside of a function if we explicitly say that we want to use it. So that's the first thing I wanted to show you in this lesson. The second thing is a little bit more complicated. Now, let me first of all say that what we are going to do is kind of pointless in the fact that we are going to write a function that does the same functionality of a built-in function already. It's called array column. So let's first of all define an array. It's actually going to be an array of arrays. So this is going to be an array of guitars, and each item within this array is going to be an associative array, so that each guitar is going to have a name. So we'll say name as the key. The value will be the actual name of the guitar, so Vela in this case. Then we will have manufacturer. I hope I spelled that correctly. And then the value is going to be, whoever made the guitar. So in that case, it's PRS. And we will have 3 guitars so that we have our Explorer and the manufacturer is Gibson. And then we will have our Strat and the manufacturer will be Fender. So this is our array of arrays. And the array column does this. It returns an array, but we pass in the array that we want to work with. And then we pass in the name of the key that we want. So if we wanted an array that contained just the names, we would call array column, pass in our guitars array, pass in the name key, and then that will give us an array of all of the names. So down here in output, we'll say guitar name, and then we will see an array that has the names of those guitars. If we change this to manufacturer, then we would say just the manufacturers, PRS, Gibson, and Fender. So we're going to write a function that's going to have the same functionality. I just wanted to point out that it's kind of pointless for us to do that because we already have that ability built into PHP. But this is a very good example for something else that we need to talk about as far as scope is concerned. So I'm going to call this function pluck, because that's essentially what we are going to do. And this type of functionality is very useful regardless of what language you're using. Many languages and many utilities for those languages have something either called pluck or something that does what pluck does. So let's first of all write how we would want to use pluck. So we'll say guitar names equals, and it's actually going to look a lot like the call to array column. And the reason why I wanted to point this out is because as you're writing your code, what is important is that you write your code how you want to write it. So as you're writing and you come across that, okay, I need a function to do something, just go ahead and write how you want to call that function. You end up with cleaner code if you write the code that you want to write and then worry about the implementation later. So we're going to write a function called pluck that we pass in an array, and then we pass in the key that we want to get. So we have function pluck, and then for our parameters, we'll have an array, and then we'll have the key that we want to retrieve. Now, as far as this actual function is concerned, we can write this in a couple of different ways. Regardless, we're going to have to loop over our array, because that's really the only way that we can get each name or the manufacturer. But how we loop is going to be the difference, because we could use a for each here. But PHP has many, many, many built-in functions that work with arrays that have their own internal loop. And many developers like to use these functions instead of looping because they think it makes your code easier to read, and it makes sense. But I'm not going to tell you whether or not that's true. That's up for you to decide. But in this case, we're going to use a function because it allows me to demonstrate different things about scope. So the function we are going to use is called array_map. And I'm just going to call it the map function because map is very common. It doesn't matter if you're using PHP or JavaScript or C# or Ruby. Doing something called mapping is something that you will do a lot of regardless of what language you're using. And the premise is this: we are going to give the map function an array to work with, and it is going to return a new array. But the contents of that array depends upon whatever we tell it to. And I know that that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but maybe some code will. So what we need to do is we need to write a function. And we're going to tell the map function what our function is so that it can execute our function. And it's going to loop over our guitars array. It's going to run that function on every item. So we're going to start with a function called return_name. And in order for the map function to work with our function, it needs to pass in the item that it's going to work with. So once again, every time it goes over our guitars array, it's going to pass each item to our function. And we want the name. So in our return statement, we specify the value that we want to be in this new array that the map function is going to create. So we have our item. We want the names of those guitars. So we are going to return item with the key name. And then that's going to give us our new array. And so now we just need to tell the map function what the name of our function is. And we do that with a string. We say return_name. It's going to find this function and it is going to execute it. So whenever we go to the browser, we have an undefined variable result. And that is because I can't type. What's the other? Undefined variable guitar name. That's down here in the output. So we have guitar names now. And let's change this other commented variable. Okay. So let's refresh the page. And now we have our desired results. We have Vela, Explore, and Strat. However, if we come down here and we call pluck, let's change this to manufacturer. We go back. Let's refresh. We still just have the names. Now, the reason why is because we have hard-coded that we want the name key from our array. And if we wanted the manufacturer, well, then we'd have to change that here. We'd have to do manufacturer. But that's not what we want. We want our pluck function to return whatever it is that we specify. So this particular solution isn't going to work because there's no way for us to get this key variable from our pluck function into our return name function. Because key is local to pluck, it therefore cannot be seen inside of return name. So this isn't a solution. Instead, we're going to use what's called an anonymous function. And it's just like it's named. It's a function without a name. So we have function. After that, we have our parameter list. And so the code itself is going to look very similar to what we just wrote, except that it's not going to have a name. So we return the item. We want our key here. And now let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh and we should see our manufacturers, right? Well, no. We get some notices. And that's because this key variable that we have used inside of our anonymous function is not in scope. So as far as this anonymous function is concerned, this key variable is something like a global. So just like whenever we specified that we needed to use a global variable, we kind of need to do the same thing inside of our anonymous function. But we can't come in here and we can't say global key because key is not global. Now we're going to get less notices. That's at least an improvement. But the issue is that we don't have a global variable called key. So instead, we have a use statement. After we have function and then our item parameter, we say use, and then we specify the variable that we want to use. So we are essentially doing the same thing. We're saying that we want to use this key variable inside of this function. It's not global, but it's still not in the scope of this function, so we need to opt in. We need to explicitly say that we need this variable. And so now, whenever we go back and refresh, we get the desired results. We have the manufacturers here. If we change this back to name, then we will see the names. So scope is, I'm not going to say it's a funny thing. It can be a confusing thing. We have local scope. And if a variable does not exist within that local scope, then you have to import it some way. If it's a global variable, you have to use the global statement. If it's not a global variable, but it is on the same level of scope, like for example, this anonymous function is essentially on the same level as key. They are inside of pluck. And so in this case, we can't use global because key is not global. Instead, we have to use the use statement. Unfortunately, only practice is going to get you used to not only working with scope and variables like this, but also getting used to seeing code like we just wrote. Anonymous functions can look a little funny and maybe even a little scary whenever you're starting working out, because you're used to seeing functions by themselves with their own names. However, the more used you get to seeing anonymous functions, the easier it is to work with them, and actually the more you will want to use them as opposed to named functions.